Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley and I manage Financial Narrative. It's great to see so many of you here today. We are broadcasting on LinkedIn Live today so that all of you can see this via your LinkedIn browser. Feel free to hit the little emojis as we go so that we know if you are enjoying what we're talking about. You can also enter questions into the chat as we go, and we'll circle back and address those at the end of the session. Um, Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming one of our founding members from Financial Narrative and one of our most active members, Mr. Dan Simon. He is the chairman of Group Vested. He is a very long time media trainer. He's been media training for about 20 years for companies including E-Trade, Amex, JP Morgan, Scottrade, Rockefeller, you name it. He has media trained for them. He's currently the media trainer in residence at Bloomberg. Um, in addition to his various responsibilities with Group Vested. Welcome, Dan. We're excited to have you here.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks to Financial Narrative, such an incredible community. Thanks for everyone who makes it's such a vibrant space, and I'm really excited to share my thoughts today.
Fantastic. Well, so you've done media training for a long time, Dan. Tell us a little bit about your history and some of the things that you've seen that are working, or actually, I think you're going to start out with what's not working. So tell us a little about
Sure.
that.
Well, I mean, I think like most people, I'm sure there are some people on this call who, were taught how to do media training. That was my background. I was given a set of slides and told how to present it. Um, and what I noticed, I think mostly because of my speech writing work, I've been the speech writer for people like Mary Shapiro, the former head of the SEC, Peter Grauer, the chairman of Bloomberg, Andy Saperstein, head of wealth and asset management at Morgan Stanley, and many others. I started to work with these executives. It was natural that they would ask, how should I be presenting? How should I think about, my presentation skills as well as my media skills? And so over time, what I noticed is that my media and presentation training really started to diverge and evolve from the sort of the classical model that I've been raised with. And as you say, I think over time, what I've come to realize is the failings of media training. Often I'm brought in by CCOs to work with executives who may have had media training in the past and it wasn't working, it wasn't sticking. There was something that it wasn't resonating with them. And I think I have some pretty clear thoughts as to why. I think that most of what we know in media training, or sort of you see in sort of classical media training, is kind of broken. One exercise that I did recently, as I was thinking about, it's one thing to do your media training and do it all the time. It's another thing to think about what it means to do media training. So as part of preparation for this, I thought, I'll buy every media training book on the market and I'll read it. And I spent Christmas reading every media training book to see, well, how is it different? And one thing that immediately struck me is that every media training book out there has some variant of 101 things you need to know for media training, or 57 tips for media training, or 275 stories that you need to learn for media training. And of course, the deep irony is that, one thing I think we can all agree on as media trainers is that we are trying to teach our spokespeople to say less and obsess. That is to say, to communicate a few key points and then repeat them until their audience really understands what they're trying to put down. We actually quite often have spokespeople who want to say 100 things, and for reasons that we can get into, we know how unreasonable or unlikely it is that any of that stuff is going to go in. So I do think it's interesting that most media training frameworks are about 100 evenly balanced ideas that they want to communicate, guaranteed to fail in the eyes and the minds of your recipients. So I think that's the first thing that I would say, is that one area where my media training has really diverged from the existing is I'm trying to focus on giving a single framework that spokespeople and trainees can understand. I think, understand that most of the people I media train are C-suite executives. They are already very compelling. They're very articulate. They're very persuasive in their own way. And they want to be entertained. They want to be, they want to have good food for thought. They don't want to be lectured to. They don't want to be given edicts, 10 commandments, 101 things you must not do. And so I think this would be the other thing that I would say is stop patronizing your trainees. They're significantly more capable than we are in certain respects, and more successful than we are. And so I think they walk into this defensive. I don't like calling it media training because I think that gets everybody sort of, that gets their hackles up. And I think that kind of, I'm going to tell you 50 things that you do wrong or you must not do. I think it just inherently does not does not encourage a good dialogue and a good transfer of information. I think the other thing that we get wrong with traditional media training is that we tend to think of it as a kind of a one and done situation. They're going to come in, we are going to impart a ton of 100 things, and they're going to walk away, and that's going to be it. I see it as an evolution. I see that first meeting as an opportunity really to credentialize myself as a support function for them, not even so much as their trainer, but I see it as an opportunity to communicate a core framework, and then buy me the political capital to go and practice that with them over time. So I really resist this idea of trying to lock everybody in a conference room for 8 hours. So nothing is going to make your senior executives resent you more than taking this kind of one and done approach to it, and trying to get those 100 things crammed into one session. So it's for me, it's about us convincing them that we have the right to train them.
Okay. So all of these things are things that I think are fairly common mistakes, Dan, that people are making, and fairly common practices, really. So how should people be doing it? What would be your best advice?
So I'll give you some overall advice, and then I'll actually dive into some of those core frameworks that I think are so different, and that I think the spokespeople that I train really respond to. So the first thing is like, don't call it media training. And I mean, a lot of the CCOs that I work with kind of understand this. Again, many of the folks that we're training here, that we're working with, have big egos. They're somewhat fragile. They don't want to be in a mind state where they're going to be lectured to. So I will call it a media refresher, or I will sort of do sort of presentation skills discussion, or some other thing. The word training can sort of be quite triggering for people. Obviously, make it fun and engaging and intellectually stimulating. I think to this point about winning the ability to come back, I think I've yet to have a session where I haven't convinced the senior executives that if they get back in a room with me, they're not going to have a good time. That they're not going to learn something. That there's not going to be something that they can apply to their life in real time. And so I think that's my first goal. It's not to sort of treat this as eat your vegetables, it's a chore, we're just going to sit here and just sort of grind it out. No, rather, I'd rather have a short period up front where I get to impress and I get to engage, and then I'm winning the political capital, if you will, to bring them back into the room for further sessions. I think they are looking for a singular framework, not a collection of edicts and mandates, as I say here. It's really very, very hard, as we know, to get an audience, as we teach in media training, to think about more than two or three things at the same time. So the idea that there's going to be 101 tips is ridiculous. Give them a singular idea that they can wrap their heads around. And of course, I'm going to teach them about all of the things that you'd expect to be taught in media training, the difference between being on video or over the phone, the importance of the voice, what you wear, on ramps, off ramps, questions, traps. Of course, I'm going to teach them to bridge to key messages. And of course, I'm going to do all of that, but I'm going to hang it off a single framework. So at least conceptually in their mind, it works. And the last thing I would just say is that it's about the method, not the message. It's a technique that I'm teaching them, and I'll work through that now. But keep the messaging separate. By all means, do it. Of course, you're going to need to do it, but keep it out of this, because otherwise, it's going to muddy it. At best, you'll have them prepped for one set of messaging and useless when the messaging changes in the future. All right, so what is my media training framework? Well, it really starts with a very simple idea, which is I sort of take them on a history lesson very quickly through Aristotle, who's the sort of father of this idea of rhetoric. Rhetoric defined as speech that is designed to persuade, and I walk them through really fundamentally how different that is, how not just different, how opposite that moment in time, that method of speech is from conversational speech, and the sort of that which is the way that they show up in the world the rest of the time. And the first thing that I'd say about this, going back to my point about fragile egos, is that the wonderful thing about this framework is that it enables you to, I think sometimes the training, so much media training focuses on what people do wrong. No, you're doing it wrong. And guess what? Senior executives who are very successful in their careers don't like to hear that very much. They certainly don't like to hear it repeated over and over again. So by framing this as the difference between conversational speech and rhetorical speech, you get to tell them that they're not actually doing something wrong. They're doing something right that has served them very, very well. It happens to be true, by the way. This isn't just blowing smoke. Everything that they've applied, the other 99% of their life, is working very, very well. It just happens to fail miserably in this very unique rhetorical environment. And so I call this the dinner party problem, which is to say, what I often get my spokespeople to do if I'm training a small group around a conference room table, I will say, let's spend some time thinking about this not as a conference room table, but as a dinner table. Let's picture the best dinner that we've been to in our lives and who's there. And it's people that we trust. And maybe it's a bunch of old friends, our significant others, maybe a few new exciting friends smattered in. We're all drinking and having a wonderful meal. We're on our second bottle of wine each. And what are the qualities of that dialogue, of that conversation that we like? Well, what makes that a wonderful meal? Well, the first thing is that there's no stakes. I don't mean to eat. I mean, the stakes are incredibly low. There's no fact checking. No one is whipping out Wikipedia to fact check their friend. In fact, that would ruin the meal, right? If we were in the pursuit of truth, we wouldn't be having a nice dinner. It is full of what I like to call happy bullshit. It's mostly just sort of noises that are coming out of our mouths. So no stakes, very low stakes environment. The other things that we do at a dinner party in natural, as sort of the apotheosis of natural conversational speech, is we tend to speak chronologically. Just to pick one thing at random, we begin at the beginning. E.M. Forster, the famous writer, once said, how am I supposed to know what I think until I hear myself say it? And that's largely how we speak in conversation. We largely begin at the beginning, and we sort of meander our way to the conclusion. And at a dinner party, one of the other qualities of a dinner party is range, right? That is to say, we love being able, the conversation, we don't put parameters around the conversation. And that means that you're going to get questions or be invited to discuss any number of things: ancient Greek poetry, backpacking trips around South America, US-China relations, the State of the Union, Kate Middleton's mystery illness. It's a grab bag of exciting, wide-ranging topics. And so, you're being asked to opine on these things, or you're being asked to weigh in on these things. One of the reasons you begin at the beginning is because you have no idea what you think about Kate Middleton's mystery illness or US-China relations. So you sort of talk yourself into the conclusion. That's actually, in conversation, how most of us walk through life talking, is sort of past, present, future. That sort of framework helps guide our thinking, and we say it out loud. We think out loud. And the other thing that we don't do as that conversation is taking on such variety and range is we don't put parameters around what we're there to talk about. I mentioned sort of whipping out Wikipedia and sort of fact checking your friends at the dinner party would earn you a disinvitation the next time. Well, so does sort of putting walls around what you're there to talk about is sort of anti-conversational. You can imagine something, Ashley, like, what do you think about US-China relations? how peculiar it would be if you were to say something in that dinner party like, well, I don't think I'm the best person to talk about US-China relations, but I'm sure there's someone at Financial Narrative that I can get you to chat with who's probably far more expert than I am. Like, that's a very peculiar thing to do in conversation. It's, as I say, anti-conversation. It shuts things down. It doesn't keep. You can think of it almost like a game of hacky sack, right? Sort of linguistic hacky sack. We're sort of keeping the ball up in the air, and you're being an active participant in that. That serves you incredibly well in the conversation. But now let's flip to a rhetorical space, a speech, a panel discussion at an event, a podcast, a TV interview. Well, we can't do those things. For a start, we have to walk into that. We can't go wherever the conversation wants to go because we are only really expert in a very, very narrow set of spaces. I am probably, I would say, one of the top 5 people in the world on the topics of communication and storytelling at the intersection of finance and technology. It's not much of an accolade. It's a bit like being the least smelly gorilla, but it is my accolade. That is true of me. If I take even one of those variables away, say communications in finance, I'm not one of 5. I'm not one of 5,000. I'm probably one of 50,000 to 100,000 people who talk about communications and finance, maybe a million. If I take 2 of those variables away, finance, communications, I'm one of tens of millions, and I'm definitely not even in the top quartile, certainly on something like finance. So our expertise bleeds away very quickly the moment we step outside of that incredibly narrow band of expertise. And so, again, one of the biggest challenges is we live and we walk around in this conversational world where we're invited to opine on everything. And if we shut that down, it's anti-conversation. We're actually considered to be rude. In a rhetorical space, we will be in so much trouble if we don't walk in with very, very clear parameters about what it is that we can and can't talk about. So at the dinner party, we don't say, I don't know. Ask me another question. But one of the things that I'm encouraging my spokespeople to do all the time is to have a very clear picture of like, that's out of my comfort zone. And talking about chronology, that's another thing that we tend to do in conversation because we are so out of the loop on so many topics. By having a clearer picture of what it is that we are there to talk about, in many ways, it helps us reach that place where we can lead with the conclusion, right? Other things that we do, and so this is where I would normally tab over to say, what do we do at the dinner party? Let me explain what we do at the dinner party that we wouldn't do in a rhetorical space in speech designed to persuade. We've covered a few of those things. We speak chronologically. We go all over the place. Naturally, I should just add, we don't prepare for those. No one goes, I'm going to a dinner party tomorrow. I need to sit down and really think about what I'm going to say. And of course, preparation is a key part of the rhetorical experience. One of the things that spokespeople often think of is that sort of rhetoric and spontaneity. They tend to think about spontaneity and will preparation kill my spontaneity? To which I would say, Mark Twain said famously, it takes me several weeks to write a good impromptu speech. Right? Actually, the best, the most spontaneous performers and speakers are inveterate preparers. And this is another area that I find classical media training really trips up. We spend a lot of time, if you just get a media training deck or a book, for example, we spend a lot of time telling people to prepare. We sort of, and we feel like that's our job done. If we've communicated to you, the spokesperson, that you must prepare, then we've done our job. And I would argue that we serve our clients or our spokespeople very poorly by just telling them to prepare, but not teaching them how to prepare. Because yes, everybody knows that preparation is key, but how much media training teaches them how to do it? Very little. I would argue that as media trainers, very few of us even understand the framework or the terms that we are communicating when we're talking about preparation. So the other core slide that I teach in my media training is around how to prepare. And again, we don't do this at a dinner party. We don't even think about these things necessarily, what I would say talking points and messages, as distinct and different. You will have heard many media trainers will use these two terms interchangeably, or you'll have all been in rooms where people say, we're going up to in front of the board next week. What's our talking point? Or we're going up in front of the CEO next week. What's our messages? People use these terms interchangeably. For me, they are distinct and different, and it's really important to communicate to your spokespeople, to your trainees, the difference between these, right? So talking points to me are external to the spokesperson. They are external to the company. They are not the spokesperson, not the company, not your technology, not your features, not your teams, not your years of experience. They are mostly what the spokesperson is there to talk about. They are the clients, the market conditions, especially in financial services, especially in B2B communications. There may be some, but there are very few interviews, Ashley, along the lines of, tell me, how do you do it? What's your secret? Talk to me about your skincare routine. How do you balance, running financial narrative with being a busy mother? Very unlikely, very unlikely. Wonderful if we get it, very rare. The vast majority of questions you're going to get, Ashley, fall into this first column, this talking points column, right? What are financial marketers interested in 2024? What's keeping financial CMOs and CCOs awake at night? Do you think we're going to see consolidation amongst brands? None of this is Ashley. None of this is financial narrative. None of this is your team or your technology. This is external. And what I want my spokespeople to do, and I tell them, is I want you to write down 3 distinct ideas. So let's use this as an interview example. Ashley, you're going to be up in front of CNN. They want to talk to you about financial marketing in 2024, financial branding in 2024, right? Very easy for you to come up with 3 distinct ideas that you want to communicate, 3 what I would call talking points, right? In 2024, financial brands have to build trust. Last year, we saw a lot of banks failing. And so building trust via branding and marketing is the number one thing that they have to do. Number 2, the challenge for financial marketers is that uncertainty is causing pullbacks in budget, so you have to do more with less, right? Very simple, distinct ideas, okay? And then we move to messages. Messages to me are the opposite of talking points. They are the internal. They are Ashley Jones. They are financial narrative. They are, what we do. And the connective tissue between talking points and messages are 3 simple words, and that's why. And that's why, right? In 2024, financial marketers are building trust. 2023 was a year of great uncertainty in financial industry with the failing of SVB and Credit Suisse. And so financial marketers have to build trust in 2024. And that is why a financial narrative, we are rolling out a range of programming focused specifically around how to build trust with consumers and enabling our users and our members to network around those ideas of trust, right? Very simple connective tissue. And this is one of the reasons I really don't like conflating messaging with media training, because I'm trying to get them comfortable with that technique. I am not, if I force that message, if I say, talk about financial narratives, incredible ski trip that's coming up, and the spokesperson has ideated this idea, good idea for a talking point. Today, CMOs are interested in building trust with consumers. It's a very hard bridge. It's a very hard thing to get to. It's bound to fail, in fact. You imagine in 2024, CMOs need to build trust. And a financial narrative, we've got this wonderful ski trip, and I'm sure that we'll be talking about that or during the ski trip. It's a very hard thing to get to. So the technique is lost. I think I trust our spokespeople to know they sort of walk around with 100 positive things that they could say about the organization. Let them identify the messages, at least for this training session, right? We can work separately with them on some additional messages. There may be some other things that we want them to communicate. I appreciate that happens all the time. Our spokespeople don't know enough about the new technology that we've developed. Our spokespeople don't know enough about the assets that we've acquired over the last 12 months. We'll get them there. We'll get them there. But for this exercise, let them ideate their own messages to bridge to. Okay, let them get it, because that's the technique that I'm teaching them. The messaging will change, the talking points will change, but the idea of being able to identify 3 talking points and then bridge very seamlessly to 3 corresponding messages, that technique will serve them for the rest of their life as spokespeople. And this is something that all of my spokespeople typically come away and say, thank you for helping me break this apart. Thank you for helping me understand the difference between the external, the talking points, often what I'm there for, and the messages that I have to go and communicate. This has made it much easier for me. And of course, this still hangs off that same central framework, because one of the things that we don't do in natural conversation is we don't bridge from talking points, which is, what do you think about Kate Middleton's mystery illness? Or US-China relations, or the State of the Union. We don't use that to bridge to our key messages. We rarely in conversation bring the external internal. We don't do it. Again, think back to the dinner party that we're imagining here, how peculiar that would be. Could you pass the potatoes? Well, these are russet potatoes. Something you may not know about russet potatoes is, I was a russet potato farmer it's a weird thing to do in conversation, right? Could you tell me what time it is? Well, looking at my Fitbit, which I am an investor in because I'm a big believer in the quantified self, I can tell you it's 1:40. That sounds strange. It's an odd thing to do, to bring in this ancillary information. And so in conversation, we never do it. And of course, what you'll find is that your spokespeople, the biggest mistake, the biggest sin, if you like, in media interviews or any kind of rhetorical spaces, is the sin of omission. They will simply not bridge. They will not bring the external internal. What do you think's happening in the industry, Ashley? Well, financial marketers trying to build trust. Great. What else is happening? They're trying to do more with less. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being here. Thank you for having me. And the interview's over. And I don't know where she works. I don't know who she is. I don't know what she does, because she didn't tell me. She didn't bridge. And that's, again, to the point about our fragile egoed spokespeople. That isn't a mistake. You're not making a mistake. You're doing what works for you. The other 99.9% of the time, the conversational spaces that you occupy, that works for you. In fact, you're rewarded for it. In fact, you're punished for introducing ancillary information. And that's why you don't do it. So as a media trainer, I'm now not insulting my spokespeople for their failures as rhetoricians. I'm complimenting them for their successes as conversationalists. And so watch as your spokespeople's demeanor changes completely. Watch as their approach to this. Yes, I'm so good at the dinner party that explains why I'm not very good at these interview things, right? And as I said, it's both very useful as a tool to build trust and to let these frameworks sort of percolate. It also happens to be the truth. It is why we don't do this. Now, the last thing, or a couple more things that I might add about the difference between conversational and rhetorical space, is that quite often when I have them fill out this exercise, and I do it, so as much as I say, don't conflate messaging with media training, it doesn't mean that I don't write things up. I just don't want you to bring in external messaging and say, this is what I need you to repeat. Let's build it together. I usually do this exercise with spokespeople in the course of a few minutes. I mean, you heard me ideate or, spitball a couple in 10 seconds. Very easy for us to fill this out. Once we've done that, and maybe we've practiced bridging, question, answer, message, I ask them, does anything make you feel funny about this? I'm about to put you on TV or on a podcast, 15 minutes. I'm about to put you on the phone with a trade reporter who's going to ask you for probably 15, 20 minutes. How do you feel about going in with this? Typically, I get an answer like, I feel good about it, but it seems like not very much to say. And what I tend to have to press to get the answer is, well, why would this feel like not so much to say? And And the answer is almost about 7 out of 10 times a spokesperson will say to you, well, it seems like if I were to go in armed with only this, I would have to repeat myself, or it would be repetitive, right? And this is another great illustration of, what heuristics, what templates are we bringing from our conversational spaces into our rhetorical spaces? What are the rules that govern success at the dinner party, right? That we are bringing into this rhetorical space, and it's making us think wrong about it. Well, one of them is we hate repeating ourselves. Repetition is the death of conversation. And so, it is almost a joke. It's a sort of common movie trope that the bore at the dinner party won't stop talking about financial marketing, right? We can't have Ashley Jones back at the dinner party. She just wouldn't shut up about the need to rebuild trust in the financial community. I was asking her all kinds of questions. I was asking her questions about Kate Middleton, and she kept bringing it back to financial marketing. I asked the questions about US-China relations, and she kept bringing it back to financial marketing. And so she's a bore. We have a word for this person in conversation. They're bore. They're boring. They won't shut up about saying the same thing over and over again. It's the opposite of that range and that variety and that eclecticism that we prize in our dinner party and our fellow dinner party guests. And so we don't like it. We try and avoid it at all possible, as much as possible. What I find spokespeople instinctively doing in the course of an interview is to add new information. So I was doing this exercise recently with a client, just this week, in fact. And we during the course of the interview, I'd asked them a couple of questions, and they hit on points 1 and 2, and we didn't hit on point 3. They didn't get to their third talking point. I said at the end, "Do you have any additional information you'd like to, or do you have anything that you'd like me to take away? Anything I didn't ask you during the mock interview?" And they added new information. Why? Because we're just conditioned, programmed, if you will, to keep adding more, keep adding more. We hate repeating ourselves, right? And so what I teach my spokespeople, and this is a sort of an exercise that I do, that's hard to train people to do. You kind of have to have learnt it yourself. But I'll do a bit of a parlor trick, and I'll say to my spokespeople, you hate repetition. I understand it. You want to avoid it. You don't want to be a bore. You don't want to be repetitive. Repetition is the death, as I say, of conversation, but it is the heart of rhetoric. And now I would say to them, tell me a speech or an orator that you think of, you associate with giving great speeches in history. So I might ask you that question, Ashley. I might say, well, tell me who you have in mind. If I say a great speech in history or a great orator, who do you think?
Lincoln. Let's go with Abraham Lincoln.
I mean, Lincoln's probably the most famous address by Lincoln is the Gettysburg Address, which ends, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Of the people, by the people, for the people. It's a specific type of Aristotelian repetition. It's called epistrophe. It's when you repeat the end of the phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people. 180 odd years later, his protege, Barack Obama, in 2004, employs this exact same Aristotelian repetition, epistrophe, in the 2004 DNC speech. So he says, we are not red states, we are not blue states, we are the United States of America. Here it's the same as government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's repeating at the end of the phrase, epistrophe. If you, instead of repeating at the end, if you repeat at the beginning, you would end up with something like Churchill's fight them on the beaches. People will fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them on the landing grounds. We'll fight them in the seas. We'll fight them in the skies. You hear this word, fight, fight, fight. And it's at the beginning. So it's called anaphora. And that's when you repeat at the beginning of the phrase. If you repeat and reverse the order, it was a big, JFK was a big fan of doing that. He said, we must not fear to negotiate, but we must not negotiate out of fear. Fear to negotiate, negotiate out of fear, repeat but reverse. And then most famously in his inaugural, he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And a fun exercise is to draw those words up on the line, up on the board, and then draw a line between them. You and country and country. Negotiate, fear and fear. And what you'll find is it forms the shape of a cross. And that is a third form of repetition. It's called chiasmus, meaning cross-like. Right? So all of these ideas of repetition were articulated thousands of years ago as the heart of rhetoric. Even simple repetition like assonance or alliteration, show up in speeches all the time. MLK said, I want to live in a world where my children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Alliteration is itself a form of repetition. It's like music. And so our ears are tuned to hear beats and sounds and repetitions. And that's why everything that's ever moved you, everything that's ever, driven you to a decision, changed your mind about something, probably had repetition buried deep in the heart of it. So I say again, repetition is the death of conversation, and yet it is the heart of rhetoric. I don't know why, but I do think it's really interesting. And that's one of those aha moments for my spokespeople. And I say, look, I want you to repeat. I want you to get so comfortable with repetition that you're going to feel like you're going to throw up in your mouth if you say it one more time. Even if you have to apologize, I want you to repeat. That is to say, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record here, Mr. or Miss Reporter, but it really comes back to my earlier point that I was making about trust in financial marketing. It goes back to that point about trust, right? So I'm training my spokespeople to get very comfortable with repetition. Now, these are all things that classic media training talks about, but by putting it inside this singular framework of saying, I want you to repeat yourself, and you're not comfortable repeating yourself. And here's why. Because you live in this conversational space. Suddenly, it's unlocked. Suddenly, it's not one of 50 independent thoughts that my spokespeople have to try and memorize wrote. Oh God, I've got to remember to bridge to my key message. I've got to remember to repeat myself. I've got to remember to be comfortable saying I don't know something. I've got to be comfortable. I've got to remember to keep parameters around what I'm here to talk about. Those aren't independent edicts or commandments. They are all part of the same framework. The framework is you do this stuff in conversation. And now I'm moving you from a conversational to a rhetorical space, and we're going to unlearn, we're going to deprogram you to do, frankly, the opposite. So you're not doing anything wrong. You're doing everything right. It's just the space that's changed. The land, the ground on which you are standing has shifted. And now we must respond accordingly to that shift. And the last thing that I would say, it's sort of very, very important. It's probably the biggest problem that our spokespeople will encounter. Is this idea about volunteering negatives. And people do it all the time. And the more comfortable and the more conversational the environment, the more they will do it. And it's one of these areas that I think your spokespeople will have the biggest challenge wrapping their head around, because they will say to themselves, we don't do that. We don't do that. And one of the ways that I like, a little trick that I like to use to get them to sort of reveal themselves is before I've even introduced myself at the outset of the training. I'll say something like, if I'm not being introduced, I'll say something like, we're really excited to meet everybody, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. But first, I'd love to go around the room, and I'd love to have you all kind of just tell me a little bit about yourself. Just a minute of however you want to answer that. Just tell me about yourself. And you'll see so many of the things that we're talking about here, right? Firstly, the need for chronology. You'll see that. So I left university in 1979, and I went to work for JP Morgan. I worked for JP Morgan for 7 years. After JP Morgan, I was at Bear Stearns for 5 years. Just this absolute beginning to end sort of biography. It's a chronology. It's parenthetically very interesting to me that we all think most people don't prepare their bios. They don't prepare their biographies. They don't prepare to talk about themselves. Why? Because it's me. I don't need to talk about. But actually, it's the thing that people fail the hardest on is explaining kind of who they are, what they stand for. They don't contextualize it for the audience. They don't lead with a conclusion. They're chronological. And of course, the biggest thing that I'm looking for in that early moment is that volunteered negativity. So they will say, inevitably, they will say something like, and I went to work for a hedge fund. This happened to me just this week. I had everyone go around the room. The kinds of things that were said, I went to work for a hedge fund, famously exploded after 4 months, and then I was unemployed for a couple of years. I got hired to be the chief engineer, which frankly, they had no business hiring me for that job because I had no engineering experience whatsoever. This is the stuff that we say 1,000 times a day. Why? Because it works, because it's ingratiating, because it's vulnerable, because it's like I bought my daughter's a pandemic puppy, and the puppy rolls over and it exposes its soft underbelly, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's really nice." And we do the same thing because we're social pack animals. We do the same thing. We expose our soft underbellies. And again, remember, it's a dinner party. The stakes are zero. So there's no cost. There's only upside to this behavior. Say three good things about yourself. You will, unless you have some form of corporate sociopathy, you will feel a burning need to say something self-deprecating. Humor, self-deprecation. Quite often, if a spokesperson is trying to explain how good something is today, they will start by explaining how bad it was yesterday. This is chronology again. Part of the risk of chronology is the things, unless things are going horribly wrong for you, then the past is worse than the present. We used to not have very many members at Financial Narrative, right? But now we have thousands. Right? Over 1,000 members of Financial Narrative now. So, that's a very classic way to talk about it. Tell me about Financial Narrative. When we started, there were just 3 of us. We didn't have any members at all. But through hard work, and because I think we have a brilliant idea that works for the market, we now have over 1,000. We boast over 1,000 members. Well, too late. They don't remember that. They only listened to the first 10 seconds of your speech. They only heard the first bit, which is we didn't have very many members at all. Happens all the time. Spokespeople do it 1,000 times a day. They don't even realize that they're doing it. Tell me about your new whiz-bang investments in AI. Well, for several years, our customers were complaining, or our clients were saying that we weren't fast enough off the block in using AI. And so we've invested tens of millions of dollars in our AI solution. And of course, the headline is clients complained that Bank X didn't have good enough AI. So ask them to tell you about themselves at the outset, before you give them a framework, before you introduce yourself and give them a framework. Just go in cold and let them do it, and they will expose all of this. They will range all over the place. They're desperately trying to avoid repeating themselves. They will speak chronologically, and they will volunteer either through humor or self-deprecation or some other mechanism. They will volunteer something which, when you read it back to them, would make for a terrible headline. And so when later in the presentation, when you're talking to them and they say, "I don't do that," it's a wonderful moment, because you get to say, "You're the one that told me you were at a hedge fund for 4 months that exploded, and they had no business hiring you as an engineer because you had no experience." And we all laughed, and it was a wonderful moment conversationally, but as a headline, it's going to look terrible. So, with all of that said, and I'll kind of wrap up here. This is the framework. And ultimately, while I have 100 slides I can walk through, to my earlier point, I'm not trying to walk them all through this in one go. I'm trying to get them to understand really two core slides. One is this one: how to prepare. I'm going to tell you that it's important to prepare, because you don't do it in a dinner party, but you're going to do it for these rhetorical spaces. But I'm also going to teach you how to prepare, how to build talking points, how to build how to bridge corresponding messages, and why those things are distinct and different. And then I'm going to teach you how to perform. So as you go, what are the conversational tics? What are the heuristics or templates that serve us so well in conversational spaces that we are going to reverse for the purposes of this rhetorical moment? And now, as we practice, if this is a media training session that incorporates practice, doesn't have to. I just did one in the city where we were breaking it apart over days. We were saying we'd do the didactic portion day 1, and then we came back and did the practice day 2. But I left up on the board all of the same big sticky pages that I had worked through. I left this one up with the talking points and messages that we worked through, and then this one that we're checking off. And so these become the two things against which we test. So we are not now going into practice interviews without a template. And that's the last thing I'd say is I think because it's 100 things and not one thing, because it's 100 things, it's almost unfair to the spokespeople when you move them into the testing phase, when you move them into the practice phase. They don't really have anything against which to measure them. So there's no yardstick, right? But now, as I do the practice, whether it's part of the same session or the next day or a week later or the next month, we're coming back to this. We're saying, I want to see you hit your talking point. I'm going to ask you generic questions about the state of financial marketing. I want to see you hit your talking point. I want to see you bridge to your key messages. I want to see you say them more than once. And then I want to see you, eliminating that volunteered negativity, the stuff that's going to get you in to trouble. And I want to see you be comfortable with your area of expertise and be clear about what you're not going to talk about, all of which so alien to the dinner party. And so hopefully I've given you an idea about how there's a lot of information to articulate, but hangs on a singular framework. It's sort of intellectually stimulating. We can make it collaborative and sort of throw some speeches out, and we'll find some fun with famous orators. It's engaging. It's very different from the classic media training. And what I find is that your spokespeople will leave wanting more. I often hear them say things like, I'm going to use this. This is good for me in my sales training. This is good for me in the big presentation I've got to give to the board next week too. It's more than just this sort of very narrow use case of the media that I probably didn't want to do anyway, and you forced me into. And P.S., if you want to bring me back to expand on this, if you want to bring me back to do a broadcast module of this, if you want to bring me back to do an hour's testing and mock interviews, I'm excited to do that. I think that's the biggest takeaway, is if you can get them to be engaged with the process, win that political capital to bring them back.
That's great. Wow. I would come back.
Right. I hope that people would think, okay, there's more to this. Let's dig into it a little bit more.
I think there is. Well, thank you, Dan. That's a wonderful framework. I'm curious, how typically do people initially react to this? When you kind of put this up, do people intuitively get it?
I mean, sometimes what people will often tell me is how different it is from the training models that they've had in the past, and they prefer this. I literally had this last week with a very senior spokesperson who said, I've been using a flawed framework, and I've heard, past, present, future. I've heard, problem, solution, proof points, whatever. Um, I'll often hear some variant of, oh, that wasn't, that would always trip me up in this. Or this is so much clearer, or this is so much of a clearer framework. I understand what talking points are. I understand what message. I know it's external to internal. So it takes a while. It can take. Obviously, some people respond to it immediately and have this big epiphany moment. Some people take a little bit more time. But broadly, yeah, these are, I actually think that these are frameworks. And I think that most media training isn't. It's a collection of, at best, do's and don'ts. It's a collection of commandments. Don't steal, don't kill, don't covet, that are kind of just raps on the knuckles. They're just this sort of, you're doing it wrong, and it's 100 distinct sort of different things that you mustn't do. And I just don't think that helps. They won't remember them anyway, and it also makes them feel bad about themselves. So mostly what I hear is like, either this is better than prior frameworks, or I never had a framework before, I'm excited to use this.
Great. So I know there are people in the audience right now who, since I think about minute 3 of this presentation, have been saying, but Dan, they have to learn the messages. When are they going to learn the messages?
Yeah.
So when do you recommend teaching them the messages? You've said not during this training.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sort of depends what you mean by messages. I'm going to do the writing because we can do it very quickly, which is sort of very counterintuitive for a lot of my CCO, partners. Really, you're going to write During the session, we're going to spitball messaging. If you make it so that there's no real risks associated with it, it doesn't matter what the words are. And I've had people who get so stuck on this sort of stuff, I'll make them do this exercise around what they had for breakfast or something. If we can't, if it's going to cause so much surus around company messages, let's just use a different example. So it sort of depends what you mean by messages. I'm going to have spokespeople by the end of this session who are ready to be trained or tested or practice interviewed on external topic, which is mostly what our spokespeople are there to talk about, what's happening in the financial marketing world. They'll be able to hit that talking point, leading with their conclusion. The biggest issue today facing financial marketers is trust, period. Now let me explain the context of how we got there. Last year, you'll remember, SVB failed, Credit Suisse failed. It's creating a lot of mistrust in the industry, right? So they'll be able to hit that, and they'll be able to bridge, and that's why, and this is only one phrase, there's a lot of ways to get your talking points and your messages to marry. This is the simplest. We can take them on a journey to learn more techniques as we go, but by the end of this session, they're ready to bridge to a message. And that's why Financial Narrative has over 1,000 members. That depth of bench means that at any one time, we've got great peers who can talk to you about their experience with customer trust, right? Now, that may not be your final message. That may not be when you say to me, Ashley, what about the messages? I might be sitting here with a document that says, no, I want to talk about the ski trip. I want to get these people to talk about the ski trip. And that's fine. But then we need to ask ourselves, what rooms are we putting them in as CCOs or communications professionals? Because if they're out there talking about financial trust and we've got a set of messages that really wants to get them to talk about the ski trip, then kind of shame on us for putting them in that room in the first place. We need to be finding them rooms where the conversation is going to be around ski trips, right? So, there's also a recognition that it's our responsibility to put them in the right rooms. So it's not that I'm anti-messaging. I understand there will be a time, as I've said at the beginning, where the biggest problem our spokespeople have is that a lot has happened in this business over the last, or this bank or this asset manager in the last year. We moved in, we've got this whole new line of ETFs, or we've got this technology, and I want to bring them up to speed on that. That's great. Let's do that. Let's have a separate session, almost a different exercise where we talk about that, where we distill and analyze that, and then create headlines for that work. I'll do a messaging exercise, but I want to keep it distinct from the technique, because trying to marry those two things, it's a bit like trying to do a driving test and learn algebra at the same time. It's sort of distinct, different. You could be a fabulous driver who happens to know integral and differential calculus, but no one is giving you a driving lesson while also trying to teach you that.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. You'll crash.
Well, so this is a great session. Well, or just fail at algebra. Either way.
Or you'll fail at that. If you're lucky, you'll just fail at
algebra. Perhaps both. So this is a great session, Dan. I appreciate all of this information, and I know that this is a really great starting point for a lot of the people in the room. How do we frame this up and get our spokespeople kind of on the right path? I'm going to open it up for questions from members now. Everybody, you can enter your questions in the chat in LinkedIn. You'll see if you kind of scroll down that there's a chat there for you to enter questions. Please feel free to do so. Dan will answer a few. He actually is able to stay until 1:30 here. So we'll be on for a few more minutes, and then we will hop off. But you can always see a recording of this either on our website or here on LinkedIn. So on to audience questions.
All right. Well, we do have a few questions that have been sent in to me privately as we've been going through this. So tell me a little bit about how we as a team help to prepare the spokespeople for an interview. Do you sit around and work through this messaging framework with them usually, or is this something they do on their own? What are the sort of steps to prepare before, during, after?
It's a great question. And I think there's lots of different ways to answer it. I mean, firstly, obviously, I like to give a brief a briefing, and I think as comms teams, I don't want to sort of, as my mother used to say, teach my grandmother how to suck eggs. I hope I'm not saying anything too obvious, but putting a briefing together, understanding the media person that your spokespeople are going to talk to, or the panel that they're going to be sitting on, or whatever, understanding the other personalities and the background of the people that they're going to be engaging with, giving them an overview of what kinds of questions are going to be coming up. I think that's a double-edged sword, because I think sometimes, and it goes back to the point about messaging, if you're sort of just teaching to the test, then your spokespeople, if they don't have the technique, could get thrown off. Right. So the problem of telling them the reporter is going to ask you these 5 questions is, what do you do when the reporter asks them a 6th question or a 7th question, or they say something that sparks something in the media person's mind that takes it into a completely different tangent? So they have the techniques that they need, thinking back to the training, right? Do they have the parameters? Do they lead with the conclusion? Do they understand what their talking points are? They comfortable repeating themselves? Because quite often the way to get out of that is to kind of bring it back to the points that you want to talk about, if it's a complete tangent. If they don't have those techniques, if all they have the messaging, then the 7th question, the 6th or 7th or 8th question is going to throw them for a complete loop. So that's why the techniques are more important than telling them what the questions are going to be. Assuming they've got the techniques down, it's still a good idea to give them a sense of what you think those questions are going to be, because they're going to then do their exercise of talking points and messaging. I think what I've discovered in the years of doing this is that people can get very addicted to the briefing sheet to the expense of their own training and their own frameworks. And to me, the training and the frameworks are more important than the briefing document.
That's great. So tell me about, you talked about the first session is really designed to win your way into the second session, if you will, right? Earn the opportunity for the second session. So in an ideal world, how many sessions are you doing, and kind of what do they look like? Or is it different every time?
There really is a sort of how long is a piece of string question. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And I want to be clear that, I have CCO partners who, have already done that hard work of building capital. It's highly organizationally dependent. For the most part, there is some element of distrust between the there is some element of distrust between the business side and the comms marketing function. There is an element of, they don't always have that political capital walking in, and they often communicate something like that to me, like, we're really trying to get the business side to trust that we know what we're talking about so that we can teach them. That's not always the case. Sometimes people say, this team, listens and believes in everything I have to say, and I've got them locked in a conference room for 2 days, and I just need you to train them. And that's great too. In which case, we would break out a didactic portion, as I said during my conversation. A portion where I'm trying to communicate this sort of stuff. It doesn't have to be a monologue. Can be a discussion. Can include some exercises, and then I typically like to do a sort of a group. I mean, what I just did with a client for 2 days last week, locked in a conference room, speaking of, is we did a didactic portion to everybody, and we broke out into slightly smaller groups, and we did what I call the Pro Bowl, which is, if you imagine you've got those 2 big stickies up on the board, you've got the how to prepare. So with 3 talking points, 3 messages, corresponding, bridging. Bridging is part of how to perform. What do we do conversationally? What do we do rhetorically? That's what we're measuring against. And just like the Pro Bowl doesn't play a full game, but rather sort of tests or just looks at passes and throws and catches, and we'll just do a sort of a small group exercise where we are just practicing getting our mouths moving and maybe answering questions. So maybe it would be, I would be the interviewer, but without that pressure. Maybe we'll just do a few questions each, and I'm letting the other. I mean, again, this is assuming that this format works for your organization. It doesn't always. Maybe you only have one person to train. So, But in this case, they wanted to train to the 10 people, broke it out into 2 groups of 5. And while someone is being interviewed, a few questions, the other people are watching to see, did they introduce negativity? Did they bridge to their key message? Did they lead with their conclusion? Did you hear a message or a talking point? Did you hear it repeated? And so it becomes a sort of a group exercise. And then I further refine down into individual sessions where, and at that point, we might stick a camera on you, we might lav you, we might put a microphone on you, we might record, put a light in your face. We might practice different types of broadcast sessions, one where you're kind of in a studio, one where you're to camera like I am right now, where you're speaking into the camera and you can't see the interviewer. We can sort of take that as far as we want, and we can go as deep as we like at that point. But again, I think people rush to stick a camera in people's faces and also get very fixated on how people's physicality manifests before they figured out kind of how to teach people or what we're teaching people in terms of how to prepare and how to perform. I think when we alleviate our spokespeople's minds the stress of like, God, what am I going to say? Going back to what I talked about, it being a qualitative exercise, not a quantitative exercise. Nothing makes your spokesperson itchier in their seat than visibly trying to remember 50 points about financial marketing. So I think, again, I'm not too worried about sort of sticking the camera and giving them broadcast media training tips until we've got those fundamentals down. So that just gives you an idea of how I broke out the session last week. But I mean, it can be configured. Think of it like Lego pieces. It can be configured however you'd like.
That's good. I'm curious. So when you've got someone who's doing well, sort of a top level executive who's doing pretty well with this framework, is following it, etc. What is the next thing? What is the next piece that you start to teach people? Or is it this over and over again, just get better at it?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to think about that question. One of the things that I always tend to end my media training on, which I think always gets a bit of a smile or a laugh, is if you remember the slide, which is the dinner party slide, sort of what do we do in conversation, and then what do we do in rhetorical spaces. And I always say at the end, the question isn't how do you do these things. The question isn't how do you eliminate negativity, bridge to your key messages, lead with the conclusion, eliminate chronology, repeat yourself. The question is, how do you do this? The question is, how do you do all of this and still sound like a human being? And if you watch the best spokespeople, sort of politicians, the Bill Clintons, where I came from, the Tony Blairs, the Barack Obamas, you will see that they do this. They absolutely adhere to this right-hand column. They are narrow in their frame. They are repeating themselves ad infinitum. They are bridging to their key messages. But they still sound authentic. They still sound human. And so I often leave people with this message that is the work of a lifetime. That is the work of being a spokesperson. I've given you the framework now, but practice is what will sort of this is the first step of a journey of 1,000,000 miles, and practice is going to be critical to enhancing that sense of authenticity, even as you're adhering to this very strict set of rules on the right hand side of the framework. I think you can think of the interview, you can think about what next in terms of the scale of seriousness of interview or environment, right? So another way to think about the answer to that question would be to say, we're going to start you on a few phone call trade conversations with trade media, or we're going to start you on some on background interviews, which I'm controlling what's off the record or on background, not you, Mr. Spokesperson or Miss Spokesperson. You don't get to use off the record. I get to tell what's off the record. We're going to put you in a very low stakes environment, and then we're going to move you to something. We're going to increase the stakes as you get better and better and feel more confident, with the final stakes probably being live broadcast, or I think actually sometimes sort of live event. The spokespeople I have tend to feel very comfortable with live events. way more than they would with, say, a phone call with a trade media person, which I think is always hilarious because the stakes are significantly higher in a live event. They just don't realize it. So it's sometimes about giving them a sense of what that scale of severity is, and holding their hand as they go through that. Is there a golden door for the super spokesperson at the end of it? I don't know. Probably ending up on a guest spot, on a regular guest spot on a sort of a broadcast show.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. As a note for everybody, this recording will continue to be available on LinkedIn as well as on the Financial Narrative website. We have lots of upcoming events. Look at the Financial Narrative website to see to register for all of those, including our April 17th summit in New York. Dan will be there. I will be there, among lots of other people. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much.